very much. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Yeah, I'm not at Cornell, haven't been recently, but maybe I'll be back there. But it's a great place just down the road in Ithaca. But I am continuing to teach at Syracuse, and I just finished up last fall when I saw you last, a course on the Holocaust and the visual arts, and I'll be teaching about the art and architecture of Jewish sacred space this fall. I want to give a shout out. I see Marlon J. Osborne up there. They are real heroes on the ground in Ukraine doing great work with cemeteries and Holocaust monuments. And I'll give them a shout out again and talk a little bit about their work in the coming lectures, not so much today. And I also see Jeff Kaufman there. Jeff, thanks for sending me all those pictures last fall. I've put them to use, and I hope you don't mind. I sent some of them on to the Center for Jewish Art at Hebrew University for their database and archive too. Well, I'm going to share the screen and we'll get started. Which one? I think it's this one. Let's see, is it? No, it's not that one. Hold on. Let's try this one. We had it working before, so well, let's not do it. One third time will be the charm. Oh, we're still not getting the big slide. So just be patient. One moment.
I thought the first one you shared was the one with the ones.
All right, but it's not moving. I'm not getting it to move to the. I'm just getting. There we go. Okay, it seems to be working. All right, so we're going to start.
We don't see anything.
You're not seeing anything. Okay, well, let's try it again. All right, hold on 1 second. View. Full screen. Let's try it again. Share screen. Share screen. Oh, now I'm just getting flustered. Hold on. No, you don't want that. Okay, you're not seeing anything still?
It just says Samuel Gruber has started sharing screen, but there's nothing on the screen. So maybe unshare again, right?
Yeah, stop.
Make a bracha.
Let's try it again. Okay, share screen. All right, let's try this screen. And I'm going to go here. Go back to it again, to the beginning. Let's try that.
Yeah.
Are you seeing it now?
Yep. Let's just go to slideshow maybe.
Slideshow from current slide. Okay, that should work.
Yep.
Go to the next one. There we go. All right, thank you for your patience. Well, I've been at this for a long time, and I thought I would just introduce sort of why I'm interested in saving synagogues, particularly the older synagogues of Central and Eastern Europe. And you'll see me here. I don't know if you can find me. I'm a little grayer and hairier now than I was back in 1973, but this was my first visit to Romania, to Raduț, Romania, and you see me there. The reason I think people like to go back to the old country, why Americans like to go back to the old country, is even when we're short here, we're often the tallest people when we get to these little towns. And you can see me, all of my great 5'7" towering over the locals, and with my mother there too. We're on the steps in front of the door of the synagogue where my grandfather was bar mitzvahed. And he came from a little village called Vikov de Sus, outside of the bigger town of Radowitz or Raduț in Romania today, which was then part of Bukovina, the easternmost province of Austria, Hungary, and they considered themselves Austrian, not Romanian. But they were so poor, they probably didn't consider themselves anything at all, except, desperate and trying to get by, which is why he came to America at the beginning of the 20th century. I was back there in '73 with my family. I've since been back there, but this was my first real encounter with Eastern European Jewish tradition. And I was surprised to find that the synagogue, this great synagogue called the Franz Josef Synagogue, was actually intact and it was still in use. There was still a small Jewish community in Raduț, and the building was in pretty good condition. It was called the Franz Josef Synagogue because it was named in honor of the great Austro-Hungarian emperor who was much beloved by the Jews of his empire, because he allowed them, he essentially emancipated them so they could move forward and do so much throughout the territories. This is a later picture from 2009 when some cousins of mine were there, and you can see the building has deteriorated a lot. The roof was bad, and this is the problem with these big buildings. If you don't maintain them, a $5,000 repair becomes a $50,000 repair, becomes a $500,000 repair. No one's got that kind of money, and pretty soon the buildings are torn down. So in Romania, the synagogue survived the Holocaust. It's because of the peculiar nature of the Holocaust in Romania, but they often didn't survive communism in very good shape. They were continued to be owned by the Jewish community, and that's a story in itself, and nominally functioned as synagogues, but as the populations declined, they were used less and less, and there was no money to invest in their upkeep. So you can see water damage from a bad roof has caused damage to the walls and to the wall paintings, so much so that everything is covered in tarps in 2009. Fortunately, an ambitious but still largely fully successful program to protect and restore the synagogues of Romania did make its way to Raduț, and the synagogue was fully restored over many years. Finally, in 2012, it was rededicated, and it was a big event. And this is what you see today. I think this is a somewhat bright photograph, but it's one of a beautiful series of photographs by the photographer Daniel Grunfeld. And you can see this picture and pictures of about 15 other Romanian synagogues on the Centropa website. Centropa is a wonderful resource run by my friend Ed Serrata, and it includes images and stories and oral histories and all family histories of Jews from Central Europe. And it's a marvelous website to dive into, and you'll just stay there for a long, long time. You can see it was so impressive. They put out a stamp, or a series of stamps, 4 stamps, in fact, honoring the synagogue on its 130th anniversary. Okay, so that's my connection. We have family connections. Why do we save synagogues? 30 years ago, I wrote a speech for my then patron, Ronald Lauder, and he delivered it. So they're his words, not mine, even though I wrote them. But we said, you preserve them because some people do it for family reasons, some people do it for religious reasons, some people do it for aesthetic reasons, some people do it for kind of historic, just to say we were here, we were here, we were here, like the Who's in Whoville in Dr. Seuss. And some people do it for all those reasons. And I think with Raduț, with Radowitz, it's a significant building. So architecturally and aesthetically, it's worth saving. If it was a church, we would try to save it, just as we try to save it. It's a synagogue. We save it for religious reasons because it was serving a Jewish community, and nominally it still does, although there are very few Jews there today. So it's important that it serve the function for which it was built. And obviously personal, family reasons, connections, nostalgic reasons, the reasons genealogists love these places, where you can trace your history. That's important too. Not every old synagogue, meets all those criteria, and some hardly meet any at all. But we have so few survivors from what once existed that we have to give special consideration to all these buildings, and sometimes cut them some slack when we think about whether they should be saved or not. This is a map from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, giving some sense of how many Jews there were in Europe before the Holocaust. Roughly about 9 million Jews in what we consider Eastern Europe. So I'm not including Germany, but I'm going from Estonia down to Poland, Romania, Hungary, former Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. The bulk of the Jews were in Greater Poland and in the former Soviet Union. And we know that that's where the largest number of deaths were in the Holocaust, but also it was where the most savage destruction of Jewish material culture and cultural heritage took place too. And that's also due to a whole series of circumstances that we are not going to go into today, but most of you know a bit about Holocaust history, so you know how the Germans and their collaborators move forward with the final solution. Recently, some friends of mine in Jerusalem, Sergei Kravtsov and Vladimir Levin, working with Michael Mayle in London, have put together a project called the Historic Synagogues in Europe, in which they've tried to collate a lot of the material we've all collected, all of us working in this field over the last 30 years, and to create a giant map to show where synagogue buildings still survive. I did a fairly primitive version of this back in the early 90s for the World Monuments Fund, but this is much more extensive, much more sophisticated. And you can see there are just pins over pins over pins once you get into Central Europe. So these are buildings that still survive in some form. These are not the buildings that have been destroyed, but you can see even here, there are many hundreds and perhaps even 1,000 or more identifiable synagogue buildings, former synagogues or prayer houses that can still be found today. The destruction, of course, of the Holocaust was vast. This is just a very random sampling. Most of these are from Central and Eastern Europe. There might be a German example here. Most of these buildings were destroyed, big masonry buildings. A few of them were adapted after the war for concert halls. But we could do page after page after page to show what was destroyed, except we don't have photographs of many of the synagogues. The sampling that we have is mostly of the grandest synagogues, the great synagogues of any town or city. The small synagogues and the prayer houses were never photographed, and the most we can learn of them usually is in a city directory or sometimes in some memory from a Yisker book. So this week we're thinking about the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Yom HaShoah was established in Israel the week after Pesach. Pesach came early this year, but the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began on April 19th, 1943. But long before that, already on Kristallnacht, as we know, in November 1938, as many as 1,400 synagogues were burned down or just looted in Germany and Austria. And then the rampage continued across Europe, particularly in Poland and what today we know of as Lithuania and Ukraine, where not only buildings were burned, but people were put into the buildings and they were burned. They became mini, their own type of crematoria, if you will, and it was just a horrific destruction. These are just two pictures of a masonry synagogue burning, and then as a wooden synagogue in Lithuania, just to give you remind you of how horrible the situation was. And then because we're thinking about Warsaw with the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, after the uprising was over, the Germans blew up the great synagogue of Warsaw on Slovakia Street, which was built in the late 19th century. And you can see it in a postcard, and then here you see it in ruins. And then today there is this, what's called the Blue Tower. When I first went to Warsaw in the late 80s, it was called the Sony Tower. Anyway, it built on the site of the synagogue. So there we have another form of destruction. How do you save that kind of synagogue? How do you save those thousands of synagogues that are gone? You try to remember, you use images, you use testimonies, and you can use art. This is a recent project by the Polish artist Gabi van Selkman. It's a sound and light show where a image of the great synagogue was projected on that blue tower on the anniversary of the beginning of the ghetto uprising on Yom HaShoah. And the sound was original recordings of Gerson Sirota, who was the cantor of that synagogue, who died in the ghetto, but he'd been recorded before the war. So it's that mix, and that brings it back to, you know, I won't say life because it's a ghostly presence, but it reminds us, it creates a world of memory. So this is a new kind of conceptual reconstruction that we have to consider, because it may be increasingly useful and necessary as we go forward in the years to come. Restoring an old building, even when the physical remains are there, can be very costly, but it's also questionable sometimes when there's no immediate use for the building and purpose. There's no community, certainly not a Jewish community that's interested in maintaining it. So the question is, even if it meets those criteria, personal history, religious purpose, well, it may not meet religious purpose, but you might be able to maintain an idea of Jewish identity and history and aesthetics. It may just not be viable financially. There may just not be a model to invest and sustain that building going forward. So I don't know how many synagogues there were and are, and these are my own estimates that I just was thinking about today because I thought someone might ask me. I figure in what we're defining as Eastern Europe, there probably were at least 12,000 synagogues or prayer houses. Now, you know, that's not so many big buildings, because prayer houses could be just apartments in larger apartment complexes. But if you consider that Warsaw had over 200, Białystok had several dozen, and almost every town and city had more than one, these add up very quickly. And so you can get to a figure like 12,000. Or if you think 9 million people, 9 million Jews lived in this area, if you figure one synagogue or prayer house for every 500 Jews, well, that's already 18,000 right there. I said before World War I, because I wanted to include the area of the former Soviet Union, because after the Russian Revolution, between the Russian Revolution and the rise of Stalin and the Holocaust, synagogues were closed all over the Soviet Union. So a lot of the Pale of Settlement, and also prayer houses were closed and buildings were adapted or destroyed. So the number at the time of the invasion of the Germans into Russian occupied territory in 1939 was and then 1942 was much less than existed before World War I. But still, it's a lot. And maybe we have 1,000 that can be identified. I was thinking back to our surveys, trying to tally up from each country, and more are known now, but maybe it's 1,000. We identified 300 in Poland. We had 80 in the Czech Republic. We had, I think, about 100 in Romania, about 100 in Hungary. So, you know, these add up to about 1,000. There probably more. The numbers that have been restored before the fall of communism, you can count. I was thinking maybe 10, but then I said, well, you know, if you count some money invested in Romanian synagogues and others, maybe we're up to 25. But since then, there's been a steady pace. And I put 250. I don't know if that's true or not, but it gives you some idea that it's still a very slow pace. And if we wanted to engage with all of the physical remains of synagogues from the past, maybe at best we're a quarter of the way there. Which is why I was saying virtual reconstruction may be the answer, because we're not going to get around to bricks and mortar reconstruction of all these buildings going forward. It just can't happen. Now, there was interest in Jewish monuments before in the Jewish and in the Christian world. Historic sites that needed to be protected. And obviously, some of these were rebuilt many, many times. So the kind of case study for this would be the Altneuschel, which everybody knows in Prague, built in the late 13th century. It was damaged in a pogrom and rebuilt. It was remodeled in the 16th century. It was restored in the 18th century. It was remodeled again in the 19th century when they opened up the women's some areas for different things, fully restored in the 1920s. And then it's been restored a few times since. Now, this is atypical that so many interventions should take place, but it was not uncommon. And even in the interwar period, we have records of Jewish communities and monuments authorities, the government arguing because the monuments authority are saying this synagogue is historic and you can't get rid of that ark or you can't change those windows. It's just like historic preservation today. And the communities would object and say, well, we've got to, or we want to, or we must. Of course, those are all moot points because all those buildings were destroyed. This was particularly common with wooden synagogues, which communities wanted to adapt, and the authorities already recognized them in the interwar years as being something special, and they wanted to protect them. So before the fall of communism in 1989, 1990, there were a few instances of sort of show synagogues, old synagogues, that communist authorities had protected and in some way restored. And these were usually in major cities visited by Westerners, diplomats, trade delegations, and others. So they could show that, look, we're not suppressing the Jews. Here's an historic synagogue, go see it, that kind of thing. But there was no real Jewish life. It was mostly suppressed. And in Prague, where there was a Jewish community, they were all really communist agents. And there wasn't much, there was no growth. And there certainly wasn't much exploration beyond the borders of these few places. So the old synagogue, the Stary Synagogue in Krakow, is another example of this. So that was the situation when I first came to Eastern Europe to look at old synagogues in 1989, and then fairly regularly, several times a year through the 1990s. And I still go, but now there's so many talented people who are doing this work on their own, and they're doing it so much better, and governments are engaged and NGOs are engaged. And, I go and give a lecture like this one, but there's very little that I can teach people, and I can't bring any money to help them. So I'm much more of an observer and I think about it more than do, like I used to do. But when I first came in 1990 to Poland, I had the pleasure of the honor of traveling around for a couple of weeks with Maria and Maciej Piechota, who were then the great experts on Polish synagogues. All during communism, they had continued to study and to document synagogues. They had published their very important book, Wooden Synagogues, in 1957, translated into English in 1959. But then they had continued to work, even though they were no longer allowed to publish and teach about this in communist Poland. And with Maria, this is Maria here, and she just died this year at, well, I think she was 98. Just a wonderful woman, and her husband here, Maciej, wonderful man. And they were my sort of mentors, surrogate parents, and taught me an awful lot of what I know today. They took me around, and here we are in the town of Jaworzyce, where there's this ruined classical synagogue from the 19th century. And here we're actually talking with an old woman. I've told this story many times before, but she used to work for the rabbi, and she said that the rabbi, once the Germans were coming, he predicted basically what was going to happen. He said, there's going to be a time when the birds don't come back, because every spring the birds came. When the birds don't come back, we'll be gone. The Jews will all be gone. And so it came to be. And that was like, I encountered that on my first week in Poland in June 1990, more than 30 years ago. And that story is still one of the most moving that I've ever heard. But it also was it's so emblematic of history, and it makes me think, we Jews, here I am, 1990, coming back, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do as the birds who are coming back? What is our responsibility? So Jaworzyce languished as a ruined building for a long time. It still had its roof in the after the war. It wasn't entirely destroyed, but it was neglected under communism, and the roof collapsed and the building fell into ruin. This is what it looked like in 1990, 1993. And then the last time I was there was 2013, and the building had been taken over by the municipality, and they turned it into a protected ruin, because it was clear that this synagogue, no matter what anyone said, was never going to be restored. It would have cost a huge amount of money, and there was no real use for it. So instead it was preserved as a monument. So just as we might think about a digital type of restoration, restoring a building as a ruin, like it's a Greek or Roman ruin, is a very effective solution, but not done too much yet. So we had ruins. There were ruins galore when I first visited Poland. This is the synagogue in Romanov in Galicia, southeastern Poland. And you can see that this was actually literally the poster child for the first conference of the future of Jewish monuments. This is an image that a painter did for us of this ruin. And it was remarkable because it was so overgrown, but it still had the wall paintings. And for me, the particularly moving wall painting, and it's a bad picture, it's taken from a slide from 1990, but it's of the Kotel, as it's written here, in case we don't know that, it's the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. And we think about mourning and a ruin, and we're seeing this painted wall in a ruin, and it's just layer over layer of really traumatic memory. And then what are we supposed to do with these ruins? Because with the Kotel, we didn't rebuild the temple. The ruin was protected, and the ruin became the site of reverence. Is that a solution? Could that be a solution for some Jewish sites? Clearly at Jaworzyce, they eventually thought that was a ruin. It was also financially more affordable than restoring the building. So this is Romanov today. Starting about 10, 12 years ago, the Jewish community of Poland created a not-for-profit which was able to get a lot of properties back through a long negotiation based on the restitution laws that were passed. And they took the properties that nobody else wanted. There was no monetary value in these properties, but we recognized that they had cultural value. And Romanov was one of these. It's a rare instance where they passed the building on to somebody else, though. They passed it on to a descendant of one of the rabbis of Romanov, who has a kind of quasi, congregation, but it's set up as an active synagogue, so groups can go there and actually worship. But you can see it's a combination of the old and the new. Restoration was not attempted, except maybe trying to stop the rising damp in the lower walls, which was not done very well, I should say. And then we have these modern arrangements of study benches and the ark, the Aron and Stenders. There was no sense to try to recreate anything that it looked in the past. So this is a solution where you protect the ruin, you recognize the ruin, but you use it and you give it back its purpose. So we're not preserving all of the building per se, but for the rabbi anyway, he's preserving the use. Once again, Jewish prayers will be said in this building. Psalms will be recited. Kol Nidre maybe. So preservation of use becomes an element almost as important as preservation of the wall surface, or preservation of the inscriptions, or preservation of the roof, or anything else. So what other ruins? Well, there were so many. These were all dark interiors. I used my flash, and I only saw what was there on the walls when I had my film developed, when I got back to America. And this is Krasnik, and this is Khmelnik, and this is Orla. All of these places have been restored today. Some through FUJ. This is this Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Monuments that's set up by the Jewish community. Some by municipalities, like Krasnik by FUJ, and Khmelnik, which is now a museum. And they've also discovered a mikveh there. That's done by the city. And here we have Orla. This is curious because Orla apparently was a church before it became a synagogue. Its early history is quite unclear, but it was a ruin when I saw it in 1990 that you see on the left. It's been preserved somewhat as a ruin, but all the surviving wall painting has been protected. And then it's a museum about Jewish history in the Bialystok region there today. Tikochin was one of the few models that we could look at. This was one of only three synagogues that were restored in Poland at the time when I first arrived there. Tikochin had been first restored in the 70s and the 80s, and it's a large Baroque building, and it actually, the Jewish quarter occupied half of the town. So this is the model that's there, and the Jewish quarter is there, and then the Christian quarter was across the Rinnik, the main square. And this is the big church, and the church was the counterpart to the synagogue. These are Jewish houses. Tikocin is a wildly popular tourist site for Poles and Jews in Poland today. It's on the way up to Białystok from Warsaw, not too far from Treblinka. And early on, a pretty good attempt was made to reproduce as much as possible what the synagogue looked at like before the Holocaust. We are blessed because we have photographs that were done by documentation teams of architects and art historians in the interwar year. All those people were killed in the Holocaust, but some of their work remained. And here we can see the replicated wall paintings and other decoration. And here we see the great ark, but of course there are no doors, there are no steps going up to the ark. It's kind of an orphaned architectural piece. The women's gallery, where there was a museum set up. And then just this year, I think it was, or was it 2018 it was finished. They did an entirely re-restoration of the restoration. They did archaeological examinations of the building. They did much more in-depth research. They came, I mean, shocking to me, these original colors. These are purported to be much closer to the 18th century original colors. And if you go to Rome today, you know, and look at Baroque buildings in Rome, you may not be so surprised, because not just synagogues, but all buildings were much more colorful than we think of them. They weren't beige or white. And then this is what it looks like today. So still similar to what it looked like in the 70s and 80s, but there's more done and it's a little bit more accurate. Wandsut is a similar situation. This building had been opened in the 1980s, saved by an individual, not by part of the government. It's in the shadow of the palace of Count Potocki, and it was filled with wall paintings, which in the early 90s were being meticulously restored. This was the first instance that I know of where Polish restorers actually brought in someone who knew Hebrew and knew Jewish liturgy, an Orthodox Jew who could proofread their text. My friend Jonathan Weber, who the anthropologist and historian of Polish Jews, served that purpose. And you can see it here. It has served as a museum, and this picture is not mine, and it's a little bright, I think, but you can see the wild decoration and the lurid colors and the weekly prayers on the walls. Right now, this has been restituted to the Jewish community, and there's an effort by Fudge to do a new restoration of this building, just as was done at Tikocin. And there are some similar projects going on. This was finished in 2012 at Dąbrowa Tarnowska. For years, this was a derelict building. This is an unusual synagogue because it was a Hasidic synagogue, a big urban masonry Hasidic synagogue. And the Nazis devastated, and the communists just left it to fall into ruin. And only finally, the federal government owned it, and finally they could do nothing. So they gave it to the city. The city then applied for an EU grant. And I should say most of the money going to these projects now across Europe is coming from the European Union. They were able to get 3/4 of the costs from the EU, and the building was restored as you see it now, as a museum and as a meeting center. Again, here they did not bring in Jewish experts, I think. And when I visited here in 2018 with a number of Jewish art experts, many of them from Israel, they were very critical. They kept picking apart the inscriptions. They couldn't admire all the work that the Poles actually had done to save this building, and they could only criticize them for getting some Hebrew letters wrong. The Poles promised they would fix them, but it would take some while to erect scaffolding in order to make those changes. So here it is as a museum. It's really good work by the town, and there wasn't a Jewish organization or Jewish agency involved. This was an entirely Polish effort. In fact, Fudge did not want this building because they knew they couldn't raise the money to protect and preserve it. and they were not eligible to get EU funding. Only municipalities could get EU funding with federal government endorsement. So that's the way the project was done. Just a few months ago, December 2020 in Poland at Boskovice, a former synagogue on the main square was rededicated as a museum and performance and meeting venue. And here you see Simcha Heller from Krakow putting up a mezuzah and giving a concert. All of this was on Zoom because no live performance was allowed. And here you see it. I can't wait to visit here on my next visit to Poland. And you can see they were very sympathetic to the arrangement of the old synagogue. So the exhibition furniture recreates the form of the bima, and we get a ghost image of where the Aron HaKodesh was. And here's the team that worked on it outside, and just one of the exhibitions inside. Now, what was the first project that I worked on in Poland? This was the Temple Synagogue. And I mentioned how Wansit and Tykocin had been re-restored. This has had to be re-restored as well. We began this project in the 1990s. It was a big project and very ambitious. It was ambitious first because it was the first outside engagement by Westerners to restore a Jewish site in Poland, and really I think all of maybe most of Eastern Europe. There's only one or two other examples. But also, the Poles were not interested. They didn't have a tradition of restoring 19th century building because they were so new. They restored 18th century and 15th century and 13th century buildings. This was recent history. So Jewish and newish, both of these were very unique, but we pushed ahead and we worked very closely with local conservation officials and talented craftspeople. And this was a model project that I was very proud of. I worked on this for about 5 years. And it's still beautiful today when you go and see it. We did not do any over painting. Unlike some of the other projects that you'll see, we cleaned all of the old patina, the decoration. It was all blackened by the urine of horses who had been kept in this, the ammonia from the urine, who had been kept in this temple. It was used as a stable. And we just cleaned it and we did very light regilding. And then these side walls had been painted red and we didn't know what the original paint was. And then one day, very accidentally, it's a long story, but I found the only photo that's ever been found of the interior of this from before the Holocaust. So we were able to see what the wall pattern was. And with computer technology, we were able to isolate the decoration, and the paint conservators were able to replicate it. But we did not replace the post-World War II very simple, almost primitive benches, which were added because the building had been looted, and we kept the bima, the center bima, which had been inserted by the post-war Orthodox community that used this, but was not the norm, was not in part of the original design, because this was a progressive or reform synagogue. It was known as the Pochapova Synagogue. So we recognized the history of the building. We didn't try to take it back to some perfect moment. We tried to protect and preserve it, but also show the changes that had taken place. And this is what it looked like, not on my last visit, because on my last visit, they were scaffolding in the building because it had been so successful in being reused that they had all these klezmer concerts, and young people, Jews and non-Jews, at the Polish Jewish festival every June would be in these balconies, which are not strong, and they're just held up by wooden supports, and they would be jumping up and down and singing and shouting with the music. And this began to destabilize the building. We didn't have the money to insert steel I-beams in this structure. So the brick began to break and the balconies began to sag. So in 2013, the Jewish community had to begin had to take a second structural repair, not repair the surfaces, but the actual structure of the building. Since we did that project, Prince Charles, among others, got involved and supported the building of the JCC there, the Jewish Community Center that my friend Jonathan Ornstein runs so wonderfully. And it has brought a new life, new Jewish life to this part of Krakow. So about the same time or shortly after we began the Krakow Synagogue, the Jewish community in Hungary thought, well, they better restore the Dohány Synagogue, Dohány Street Synagogue, the big 19th century synagogue by Ludwig von Forster, one of the great sort of Moorish buildings, and just so important in the history of European architecture. You can see these are pictures I took in the early 90s. The roof, the ceiling was collapsing, so everything it was hung with plastic to catch all the plaster that would fall, because if you walked underneath, things would fall on your head. The roof had to be entirely removed. I was scared stiff when I walked up. It's a big drop down to the bottom, but these guys would just be walking across these beams with about I don't know, is it 100 feet down there? I don't know how far it is to the floor. I was sort of crawling along the boards to see what the work was like. In the end, this was done, paid for almost entirely by the Hungarian government. It was way too much money, more than the World Monuments Fund could come up with. It was about $8 million to do the whole project, even in the 1990s. And they did not do what we did in Krakow. They repainted. So they used the old designs, but everything is repainted. So when you go in there, it is really brilliant. It looks like it was made yesterday. And even though this restoration is more than 20 years old, it's still, the last time I was there, it was still pretty bright and overwhelming. But it is an amazing space, one of the largest synagogues, if not the largest synagogue in the world. And you can see it has double levels of galleries, very unusual. And it's definitely a monument, not just for Jews, but for all Hungarians. Here you see it. Now, Hungary has a lot of synagogue buildings because the Germans were so busy killing Jews there in the end of the war, deporting them to Auschwitz. They didn't have time. They weren't interested in destroying cultural heritage. That could come later, but they were already, the Russians were advancing. They were just interested in fulfilling the final solution, killing Jews. So a lot of the buildings tended to survive. But when the communist regime came in, they were all essentially denuded. The Jewish elements were stripped, and most of these buildings were turned into concert halls or workers' clubs or social clubs or schools, art schools, things like that. And over the last 30 years, some of these have been given some kind of new identity, Jewish identity, but for the most part, they've remained public monuments, but they've had to be restored more than once with new roofs, new utilities, new electric, new structural work, new landscaping. And when this has been done over the years, generally some nod to the Jewish past has been added. Often there's an exhibition about the Jewish heritage of the town, the Jewish history of the town, the fate of the Jews. And that's the case in Zalaegerszeg. Excuse my Hungarian pronunciation. This is a beautiful building from 1904, a well-known architect, Joseph Stern. And it was been used as a concert hall since, I think, 1973, it says in the 80s here, but only in 2014 did they put in an exhibition about the Jews. This year, during COVID, about eight or so, maybe more, Hungarian synagogues serving other purposes for the most part have received work. So even though the pandemic's been rampant, work has continued to maintain, and sometimes it's actually been easier to work on buildings because they haven't been used, they've been closed to the public. All right, so very quickly, I'm going to give myself about eight minutes, I think. The big cities have big synagogues, and for the most part, in most capital cities of Eastern Europe, in the 90s and early 2000s, at least one synagogue was fully restored, sometimes more than one. In Kiev, there are 3. But in Sofia, this is the big 1905 synagogue, kind of Byzantine design, and it was restored in the early 2000s, but continued, restoration has continued, and most recently is 2014, they had to do roof work. This is a little project I got involved in with the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. We were doing a survey in Bulgaria of Jewish sites, Muslim sites, Protestant sites, and we discovered that there was this little synagogue in Plovdiv. And interesting because there is an ancient synagogue from Greco-Roman times also in Plovdiv. It used to be called Philippopolis. And it was still used, but it was in ruinous condition. So these are pictures. I took my first visit there in 2002, and we were able to raise the funds from American donors and foundations. It wasn't that expensive, under $100,000, and we were able to restore the building. And this is the dedication ceremony in 2003. And these are two US commissioners, Michael Levy and Ned Bandler, one Democrat and one Republican, both of whom were fully invested in this project and really made it happen. And both Ned and Michael, even though this was 2003, they're still on the commission today. So I just spoke with them recently to see what's going on in Bulgaria. Latvia, the synagogue in Riga, a very interesting building from 1905. It's sort of an Egyptian revival, very unusual. It was in okay condition, but lots of essential repairs needed: roof work, mechanicals, plaster falling off, windows broken, but it was still standing. And a big restoration took place around 2009, and you can see what it looks like today. It's quite beautiful, kind of an Art Nouveau Egyptian revival design. In Hungary, the World Monuments Fund got involved in this project. It's one of the oldest synagogues in Hungary, a Baroque building up in the wine producing area in the northeast, in Mod. This was done in cooperation with Hungarian preservation authorities, and it was begun in 1795, the building, but mostly it's from the early 1800s. But its decorative program is probably from the 1920s, and that's the only color that could be found sort of in the investigation. That's the only pattern that could really be understood and replicated. So we see this Baroque central beam synagogue with a much more late 19th century, early 20th century design. But it's quite brilliant. The colors are maybe a little brighter than I would have expected, but we followed the advice of the conservators, and that's what they did. It's that whole area in Tokaj in the northeast is now a great place for Jewish tourism. There's several old Jewish sites that have been protected, and that's where a lot of kosher wine was originally created. My sister wrote a great chapter in one of her books about how the wine was made there and then shipped up across Slovakia up to the Hasidic courts in Poland, but the kosher Tokaj wine. And I think Ronald Lauder actually bought vineyards there in the 90s and they were making wine there again, and I think they included kosher wine in that as well. Boskovice, one of my favorite places in Moravia. This was it's a little synagogue, and when we first encountered it through the urgings of Jaroslav Klinovsky, an architectural historian and preservationist out of Brno, it was totally whitewashed. There was no decoration visible, but this was returned to the Jewish community of Brno, which is the nearest town with Jews, and they started taking off the whitewash, and they discovered some of the most remarkable paintings underneath, and these are some of the very best preserved wall paintings of any synagogue in Europe. And they date mostly from the 1600s, and these are just some of what you can see. This project took a long time to do, but it is really glorious today. And this is a mikveh that's found across the street. A lot of mikveh are showing up. One was found not too long ago in Khmelnyk in Poland. So we know that these were used. Not a very pleasant place to go have your ritual bath, but it's a few steps down in the basement of this house. There may have been others. But Boskovice is really marvelous. And it's one of many sites now that across all of the Czech Republic, which have been restored, and with a large 15 million euro grant from the EU, infrastructure has been created to support tourism, and there are exhibitions in different places on different aspects of Czech Jewish history. It's really the most ambitious and the most marvelous and the most professionally executed a project that I know anywhere of its type. I had the pleasure to drive around for a couple of weeks in 2018 with my sister Ruth Ellen Gruber, and for a few days with my friend David Kaufman, who some of you have heard here, the New York American Jewish historian. And we went to 3 or 4 synagogues a day, and it was just a marvelous trip. But decoration shows up in the weirdest places. So this is a little prayer hall that was discovered quite by accident in the town of Bedzin in south central Poland. Bedzin was a big Jewish center, but there are no Jews there. Very few, no, really a handful of Jews there today. This was one of many prayer houses in the town, and this was created by the Cooperman family. They were wealthy people in the late 19th century. And it's really just a large apartment in an apartment building, but it was a prayer house. So when I talk about there being maybe 12,000 synagogues and prayer houses, you have to think that there were a lot of these in buildings across cities. This is a particularly large and very nice one, and it was filled with paintings that were probably done in the 1920s, I would think. And you can see beautiful views of Jerusalem, and there are scenes of temple implements and of Rachel's tomb and all other sorts of things. And more, some of these prayer houses are coming to light. And I should say that the Bedzin one is being managed and has been restored entirely by private individuals who created a foundation called Cooperman's Gate Foundation. And they show students, and they show church groups, they show Jews, anyone who wants to see it. But it's a real shoestring operation. Now, this is a building right on the big square in Krakow. This was owned by the Jewish community before the war, and it was restituted to the Jewish community of Krakow. They didn't realize what was in it when they got it, and they leased it out for income. And there was I think it was a dance school in the lower area with these big windows. Pretty much any architectural historian probably could have told you that this was probably a prayer house. But they found under the whitewash there all of these paintings. And these are also interwar period paintings, and they're quite marvelous. The problem is the community had a lot on its hands. They have several other synagogues they're managing, and they really wanted the income from this very well located building. So they did not turn it into a monument, or they did not turn it into a museum. They let it out to a nightclub and to a cafe. I'm not sure who is in there now. There have been 2 or 3 tenants. But the transformation somewhat damaged the paintings, and also it's very inappropriate for a former sacred space, for a former prayer space. But you know, that's life. That's things happen. We have a lot of wall painting that's showing up now in southern Ukraine. These are photos by my colleague Christian Herrmann, who's a great German photographer who travels. He's indefatigable in traveling these routes where nobody else goes except for maybe Marla and Jay Osborne, who are on this call. And these are in the southwest part of Ukraine, Bessarabia, right next to Romania and Moldova. And just some amazing wall paintings are showing up in buildings that people didn't even know had been synagogues. And these are, again, all been whitewashed, and you discover what's underneath them. How these will be preserved in the future is totally unknown. So look at this building from Nova Selica. Where is Nova Selica? Nobody knows. It's actually only about 80 kilometers from Radutz, from where my family came from. It's just right across the border. You can drive from Radutz to Nova Selica in about an hour and a half if you can get over the border. So there's a potential for and you'd go via Siret, and we'll look at Siret next week when we look at cemeteries, because it's one of the great Jewish cemetery for art in the world. And you could have a great Jewish travel route in this region, transnational. They've had some success with that in the Baltic regions and across from Poland into Lithuania. So it's possible something will develop here too. So look how rich these paintings are, but what will become of them? What will become of them? We don't know. And this reminds me, this just brings me, some of you heard my American lectures. I talked a bit about the rescued mural in Burlington, Vermont, and you can see there's a certain vague but a correspondence there between this art. They're probably roughly contemporary in date. And then we'll end this up. This is a project in Ukraine that I just read about on JewishHeritageEurope.eu, which is the go-to place for everything going on with preservation. And this is also in Ukraine. And this is a place where there are wall paintings on the ceiling still intact. And there actually is a project underway to turn it into a museum and a memorial, but I don't know who's doing it at the moment, and I don't know where the funds are coming for. There are lots of good intention projects that begin, and it's very hard often to move them forward and get them over the finish line. And when something's in a remote place and there's no economy to support it, there's no obvious audience to use it, there's not a lot of tourism, even the best intentions sometimes don't get you anywhere. But you never know. Sometimes perseverance pays, and projects that were begun 20 years ago, come to fruition, much, much later. All right, I'm going to run through and end. These are more Czech images. This is Pilsen. This is Brezhnici, and these are just marvelous restorations. And the Czechs have put together a wonderful tourist route. And since I mentioned my sister Ruth, who runs the Jewish Heritage Europe EU webpage, and my friend David Kaufman, here they both are on the bima in the Renaissance Synagogue at Brezhnici. I'm going to flip through these. Oh, I needed to show Pakruojas. I'm taking too much time. Lithuania, wooden synagogues, and one of the most famous that survived, most did not, is the one at Pakruojas or Pakruoy, and this is the one that that Ari's family comes from, this town, and it was restored into a children's library just in the last few years. And here you can see they've replicated the old paintings, which we have from historic photos, and it's perfectly appropriate for this new use. And that's a great change because we have very few wooden synagogues and very few have been saved. And in this case, the Lithuanians have really done a good job. All right, so we're gonna stop now and we'll save these other ones for some other time. But we have a few other instances of wooden synagogues that have been saved in Latvia, very simple buildings. And then we have just a lot of other buildings that are up for grabs. Just in recent months, the Belarus government has offered several synagogues for sale, former synagogues for sale, for very low prices. So if you want to get yourself a former synagogue in Belarus, now's the time. Once again, what do you do with these things when you save them? How many Jewish museums can a country support? How long will Jewish tourism be a thing? Will there be another generation of Jewish genealogists who are interested in tracing their past? We need to, as Jews, we want to recognize these places as important to Jewish heritage. As preservationists and as cultural property managers, we need to broaden the audience. We need to tell the story more widely and get other people interested and have more things happening in these places so that people actually come and visit. And then local people feel they have a proprietary interest in their long-term care. So we'll see. The same thing applies to cemeteries, and we'll be looking at some of that next week. Holocaust sites, somewhat different, and that'll be our third presentation. Okay, thanks for listening. And for those of you who want to stick around, I'll take some questions.
Thank you. Just a note, since you rushed through my town of Pakruojas, I spent an hour on it this morning with my family, so it's okay. I've had a lot of time in there, and that was actually a surprise. I read about it, and But I wanted to share the following surprise and why it's so important to keep these places. First of all, I didn't know we were going to go to Pakroyas till late in the game when I was going to Lithuania. And then I found out there was a wooden synagogue, and we had Mark Michael Epstein. He never mentioned about the wooden synagogue. So I thought we should go. I told our guide, we got to go to Pakroyas. This is my dad's family's from. And I heard there's a wooden synagogue. So we drove by, parked the car, walked in. No one's in there. Lights go on. We look around, and I said, oh, it's really cool to see the art that Mark Michael Epstein had showed us. And then all of a sudden, the light goes on upstairs. And our guide said, oh, there's a little museum upstairs. So we went upstairs to the museum. We climbed the stairs. And sure enough, there's a museum with like plaques that talks about the history of the Jewish community in Pakroy, in the area, and some of the famous people. And then there's a sign that says, this is what the community looked like in 1935. Here's the street view. I look down, and then I'm looking through the names, and there's my great-grandfather. And there's his house. And there's a map. And he's in the museum. So we called the lady over. She said, I'm the first person to ever show up to show that that's my great-grandfather's house. And we walked across the street and we found the house. So there is something to be said about these spaces used, and this space is being used. I don't think it's a children's book. It's a community space used for concerts and lectures.
Oh, maybe they've changed it. It was intended to be a children's library when I was there.
No, it's not children's library. But for us to see what a wooden synagogue looks like, to see the art, for me as a descendant of someone who may have prayed in there, but certainly lived there, find my family in there, and then tie it into the whole part of what's going on in that community. It's a great way to get people to go to that part of Lithuania. It's great. There are many families that come from that area, and it was a highlight, unexpected to find my family.
If I can respond to that, Eric, just a sec. One of the things, the museum is up in the women's gallery, no doubt, and that's the norm. And one of the things that irks me about most of these restorations and the museums and exhibitions that are put in them is that the women are essentially ignored and forgotten. And that's both the women collectively and the women individually. So if you see pictures, it's usually pictures of men, often rabbis and others, and all of the attention is given to the restoration of the men's space, the main space downstairs, and there's no explanation about what women's role was in the community and in the synagogue itself. I now try to go, and I've written several blog posts along these lines, and I will do more, to ask where were the women. And when I come to a synagogue, I do a little gender bending, and I try to imagine I'm a woman and I can't go in the front door and into the main shul. I cannot do that. I'm not allowed. And rarely, maybe on Purim I might be allowed, maybe for a wedding, but there are very few occasions where I would ever step foot on that floor and go up close to the Aron HaKodesh. I go upstairs, often twisting and winding, sometimes outside, sometimes inside, and I go to balconies. And the balconies sometimes have good sight lines, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the heat rises and they get very hot. So that's something that I'm looking at now, and I'm talking to curators and I'm talking to conservators to kind of educate them. And educating local people is really important about Hebrew letters, as in the case of Dombrova Tarnowska or Wansut, about Jewish customs, about other aspects of Jewish life. And Ari, the next time you go to Krakow, I'm sure if you give them advance notice, they would probably ask you to give a talk or to meet with children or students and talk a little bit about whatever you wanted, but Jewish life today or immigration to America, or what's your lineage and what happened to all of those people who came from Krakow. And there is real interest, real intense interest, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work.
Marina asks, are there synagogues for sale in Vitebsk? Before you answer that question, how much does it cost to buy a synagogue in Belarus these days?
Well, you could buy one for a few $1,000s. I actually, if
we could see a speak if that.
If you go on JewishHeritageEurope.eu and type in Belarus under news, over the last 3 or 4 months, you'll see at least 3 synagogues that have been listed. One of them is a ruin in Vitebsk. And Ruth says it's the synagogue that Chagall prayed in. I don't know if it is. There were many synagogues in Vitebsk. It was a big Jewish center. But it is a ruin and nobody wants it. And the city doesn't want it. So if you have an idea, you can buy it. But I don't want it to be like someone who sees houses are really cheap in Syracuse on the west side and they never have come to Syracuse and they buy it and they think they're going to make some money or they're going to do something, and then they never take care of it and it gets more and more in ruins and it doesn't pay taxes and it becomes more of a blight than it ever was. So if you know a group that wants to do something and really will do it, engage. But the big synagogue in Swonim, Belarus, which was actually a project that I tried to get going 30 years ago, but because of the difficulties working in Belarus, it was impossible. That's the best preserved synagogue in Poland. It's a big Baroque synagogue with big 4-column central bema and vaulting, and there's some wall painting and extraordinary. And it would cost millions and millions and millions of dollars to restore. That has just been bought by like a blogger or a writer for, I don't know, $40,000 or something, because nobody else would step up, partly because the stipulations for the restoration are so draconian. It has to be done in a very short time. And it's very impossible to see how anyone can organize a project and raise the money unless they're already extremely wealthy to do that.
A question that's related to what Joe Goldenberg asks. He wants to know what's going to happen with the Great Synagogue, I believe, in Vermont. And in fact, those who came with us to Europe and to the trip in July 2019. No, we actually went to the dig and we saw what was going on there. But before you answer that question, a general question: did each major city have something called a Great Synagogue, and also something called a Coral Synagogue? And you can tell us what the difference is and if that, where you find those.
Great Synagogue was more an applied term. It wasn't the actual name of the synagogue. Most synagogues, though, didn't have names the way we do. We give it Bethel, Emmanuel, Shari Zedek, something like that. B'nai Israel. So it was just the city synagogue. The Great Synagogue was the communal synagogue. It was usually the biggest synagogue, but it was the one which the community supported. And the rabbi, the local rabbi, the main rabbi, would be required to give, to speak there like twice a year. Rabbis didn't preside in services like they do today. And the rabbi was responsible for the Beit Din and for overseeing kashrut, other kinds of things, but not the running of the synagogue. So usually it was the biggest building, but there would be many other synagogues and sometimes clustered right around it like chicks around a mother hen. And if there's some great photographs of the synagogue in Lebumo in Ukraine, and there's a wonderful English version of the Yisker book for that community. And there you see a big picture of the great synagogue, which is an 18th century, maybe late 17th century synagogue in Lebumo, and then big masonry synagogue. And then these little synagogues, there's the tailor's shul, and the chairmaker's shul, and every group had its own little bet midrash or little shul, and that's where they would go 3 times a day to daven. That's where they would go to study, and they might go to the Great Synagogue on Shabbat and on the main holidays. The problem with these great synagogues, they're big, but they had no heat, they had no electricity. They were horrible places to hang out in, and in cold weather, they didn't even use them. So some cities would have a summer synagogue and a winter synagogue. A great way to learn about this a bit is to read the memoir of Meyer. It's called "They Call Me Meyer July." He's the father of the great Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimlet, and she edited this volume. But he talks about all these different little places. He's a kid, but he remembers it, but very explicitly. And it's a great introduction to the way these towns worked before the war. As far as the choral synagogues go, the choral synagogues are places where there was a choir, and that generally meant it was a follower of the Haskalah. So it would be, that is the Jewish Reform movement. So it would be some form of progressive, not what we think of as Reform today, but there would still be separation of men and women. They'd do the full liturgy, but they would do the sermon in the vernacular. men would wear modern clothing. And anyway, so the in Vilnius, the surviving synagogue, and the one that's used today, is the Coral Synagogue. And the reason it survived is because these were the synagogues that were used by the wealthier, more modern and less traditional members of the community, who generally built their houses in nicer neighborhoods further out from the center in the old Jewish areas. So when the Germans or then the communists destroyed all these old areas where all the old shuls were and all the prayer houses, they didn't destroy these more almost suburban. I mean, you can walk to it, but they were kind of suburban at the time buildings. And so these, after the war, became the only Jewish synagogues that survived. And then they were taken over by the community, the Gemeinde, and most of them became nominally Orthodox at that time. And that's what we saw at the synagogue in Krakow as well.
So just last question with time for it. It was in the context of a question I believe Joe had asked. Do you know anything about the plans for the Great Synagogue that we had all seen that they're excavating in Vilnius?
I'm not getting good. I didn't get good audio on that. Can you repeat
Yeah,
that?
people are saying my audio is not working. I don't know why. I just bought this new headset, so I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better.
So the question is, do you know what they're going to do with the Great Synagogue in Vilnius that they're excavating?
Oh, well, the Great Synagogue in Vilnius is not there, of course. It was partially destroyed by the Nazis, but mostly destroyed during the Soviet period. In recent years, my friend John Seligman has been leading archaeological excavations with his Lithuanian counterparts, and they've uncovered a significant part of the foundations and the bima, different things. The final how things will resolve in the end, it hasn't been decided. I spoke at a conference a few years ago on what to do with the site of the Great Synagogue, and there were many proposals. I think the idea of rebuilding it, reconstructing it, has been thrown out, as far as I know, which isn't as ludicrous as it sounds, because there's some other very famous monuments in Vilnius which have been totally rebuilt, a church and a palace and whatnot. Whether to turn it into some kind of memorial park, as was originally proposed by an Israeli architect, a very talented architect, who 20 years ago put forward a great, beautiful design. But now that seems somewhat inappropriate given the nature of the archaeological excavations. So, I don't know. I think there'll be some kind of archaeological park and a museum. Maybe it'll be enclosed in some way. Again, think about a Roman ruin, and then there'll probably be some little museum building connected to it. I think there's going to be a lot of thought still over the next several years about what's going to happen. So stay tuned. But if you read Jewish Heritage Europe, and also the Vilna Shul excavation has its own webpage, you can get up-to-date reports on what's going on there.
Well, I think that's what we have time for. This was part one, the preservation of Jewish monuments in Eastern Europe, and talk about preserving synagogues, as you mentioned, next week, preserving cemeteries. Many of us are interested in these projects, what's going on. And I think most of us are here because we were using the topic, or it actually relates to us because we still have connection to those towns because of family. And it's interesting to see what's going on with the old synagogues that some of our grandparents, great-grandparents built, prayed in, and certainly a part of our Jewish community for hundreds of years. So thank you for all your work that you have done in that regard, and your other guests go on for their work, and your sister, her work, and the Osbornes you mentioned.
Yeah, your audio is still not so good, Ari, but we got the thank you. And I want to say, if you have questions, I very much appreciated your questions last time in October about American synagogues. Now I'm getting an echo. Send your messages, your questions to Ari, and he'll forward them to me. But if you want to contact me directly, if you can remember it, I'm not putting it in the chat. It's Samuel Gruber, all one word, at gmail.com. But I think Ari likes to see the questions. He likes to know what you're all thinking. So, you can CC us, send to one and CC the other, or send to Ari and he'll get it to me. and give me a few days to respond or a week to respond because I'm pretty busy.
So thank you all. Sorry for audio. I don't know why. I had great audio all day. Today's the worst time, I guess. Maybe it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, everyone. You know, my neighbors are Harris and Jan Schultz, and God knows what they're running. They're watching this and probably watching movies and eating up all the bandwidth in the neighborhood.
Now
Thank
you're
you.
good.
Have a great day, rest of your day or evening, and nice to meet you, Osborne's. Thank you, really, for your work. We'll see you this week, and a lot of programs coming up. Take care. Good to see you. See you next week on the same time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.